Have you ever wondered why certain shows were off limits to you as a child? Probably because of swearing, sexual content, the occasional use of the word penis, right? Well, that is true, but there's a deeper layer than that, for me, anyway. It all started when I was around 6 or so. At this age, I loved doing everything that was exactly the opposite of what I supposed to do. If you said don't touch the cake I made for your aunt's wedding, I probably end up devouring the whole fucking thing in one sitting. So obviously when my mother told me to watch the Adult Swim portion of Cartoon Network's lineup, I made it my goal to watch it every night. I hadn't gotten away with it for a few nights. Every night I would sit on the floor with the television remote on the hand, giggling at how I was getting away with going behind my mother's back. Unfortunately, my fun didn't last forever. I would say I was only been sneaking to watch the channel for about a week or two before my mother began to catch on. It started with her noticing my various stuffed animals would be left on the floor on the television at night. She then began noticing when I was more sluggish than usual, huge sign pointing to the fact that I had been sleeping. But the last straw was when she finally caught me with my face glued to the television screen. I can't recall what was on the TV screen exactly, but I do remember the word penis being repeated over and over in the chat-like phrase. Looking back, I could easily have been any Adult Swim show that had been ever aired. I mean, just the other day I was watching a Mission Hill episode where some pervert whispered the naughty word over and over in a payphone. Who knows? Maybe that's what I was watching then. Anyway, none of that matters now. Really, didn't matter to me then. All that mattered to me is what I was just caught doing something what I was strictly forbidden not to do. So, what I did, every other 6-year-old caught with their hands in the cookie jar would do, cry. Could easily attribute with all the throat problems I have today at that night. I'm pretty sure I busted a few things in my throat from crying so hard and long, begging for my mother's forgiveness. She stood firm in her decision, giving me an old-fashioned spanking before sending me straight back to bed. It always has been hard to make my mother angry, but once you did, she could be a real witch. Hell, well, at least that's what I thought then. I actually appreciate being set when I was. After that night, I vowed to never watch Adult Swim again. That, of course, was just one of the many childhood vows I made myself to. Like when I got the stomach ache from eating too much and vowed to never eat chocolate cake again. I probably could have kept that promise with the shows not replaying in my mind. They were so different from the shows my mom wanted me to watch. They were daring and forbidden. Something I craved even as a child. Not only that, but all my friends were watching these types of shows at school, even though they were only in the first grade. About a week or so had passed after I'd gotten caught. My dad has finally come for a visit. My parents have gotten divorced not too long after I was born, so I only got to see my dad when he came out for a visit. It was the first time I had seen him in nearly a year, so I couldn't wait to hear the stories he had to tell. My dad had always gone with his jobs, traveling around the country to chase storms. Why he enjoys something like that, I'll never know, but to each his own, I guess. Anyway, after listening to what felt like a never-ending number of stories about tornadoes and other storm phenomena, I was finally in my bedtime. Luckily, I wasn't confirmed to the usual 8:30 curfew when my dad was visiting, so my mom let me stay as long as I wanted. My dad always had been a pushover when it came to giving me anything I wanted. I think he felt guilty for never being able to see me except for once every year or two. So, when it was nearing 1 in the morning, he had no problem staying up to watch television with me. sat up in the front of the television with a smirk on my face. I knew my dad would let me watch whatever I wanted, especially when he was an avid fan of nearly every adult cartoon on the market. I even recall wearing his South Park shirts, which could be easily draped down past my feet when I was that age. My mom never liked that too much either. But I just chalked it all up to her for being overprotective. Okay, I'm trailing off to my life to the mini-series. Let's get back on track. I asked as sweetly and politely as I could. I bet the best pout on my face I could muster we could watch a new show I found. I told him the channel he didn't hesitate to turn on over, even though I'm positive he knew no kiddie show were playing at that time of night. I remembered I received a jolt of the same feelings I had prior to my mom pulling the plug after the hour's television fun. I felt excitement, mischief, and the subtle sense of fear I always got from watching those cartoons. You had to admit that most of the stuff that plays on those lineups can be pretty scary to a 6-year-old. During the commercial break, I could hear my dad snoring his signature snore that could easily be used in place of a frog horn. I was irritated by this, so I slid closer to the television in order to be able to actually hear the show. I sat there watching whatever show was on for a few minutes. I started to feel my excitement fade and be replaced with this feeling of paranoia, which I often got when I see these types of shows on television. I kept looking over my shoulder, making sure the characters weren't there. Why, I don't know. I was a sensitive kid and stupid things would scare me. I do remember the screen cutting from the show and transitioning to a black screen, which is pretty normal for Adult Swim, as they usually began commercials this way, and had many commercials where the logo of the channel is displayed on the black screen. This always has caused my heart to stop a little. I hated the feeling of the stillness and the silence of those commercials as a kid. It always made me feel uneasy. For some reason, the feeling was a little more intense this time. Not anything that would make me bolt out of the room. Yet, I was sitting in the silence with the feeling growing stronger each second that the logo didn't appear. I noticed that it was taking longer than usual, as if the station had gone into dead air. The screen jolted at the point, which I thought it was a sign that it was the logo that was going to appear. A logo did in fact appear, but it wasn't the logo I had come to expect from the previous time I had watched the channel. It was a simple logo, scrolled over the center of the screen with the white lines. It wasn't too fancy. The cleanliness and the sharpness of the lines made it up for it. It was hard to tell if the logo was at first, as it just seemed to be a bunch of crisscrossing lines held within a thick box. It looked a lot like the National Geographic logo if it all had its colors drained. The logos began to fade into black. The sound you usually hear before most movies of the 90s, I believe it's the THX sound effects, blared. I was surprised it didn't wake up my dad. We now present our featured presentation. A man boomed, sounding like the person that narrates over the movies in the theaters. You know, the man who tells you to shut your cell phone and buy loads of popcorn and candy. Instantly, I felt tons better. I figured that this wasn't just how Adult Swim presented their movies, and after a day of watching nothing but Disney, I was excited to see the shows and movies all my first grade friends get to watch. The only thing I could think about was bragging to my friends that I had seen an adult movie on the Forbidden Channel, not to be mistaken with porn, guys. The movie started with the little droplets of falling from a dark sky. The mixture of the translucent rain were droplets of scarlet, which were supposed to be blood, although it looked much more like paint that's packaged in those old paint-by-numbers. Then again, you can't really expect much more than the low-budget Adult Swim film. Plus, blood wasn't exactly rare amongst their programs. It's just another reason why my mom doesn't allow me to watch the station. After the show of rain and blood, one of the main characters would be seen from a bird's eye view. Their hair would be a rich and vibrant purple color. However, the color was fading. The rain seemed to be washing it away. As you could see clearly, the purple dribbles sliding down the character's body. The scene cuts to a close-up of the character's face. It was a young woman, cartoon character. Her eyes were nothing but slits of black, resembling an electrical outlet. She herself resembled a huge electrical outlet, which was carried by the long, tiny sticks for legs and arms. Imagine the legs and arms from SpongeBob SquarePants episode Frankendoodle. That's the best way I know how to describe it. Her pitiful excuse for an arm lifted upward, the camera panning up the span of the stick, zooming upward until you could see a glass window. For whatever reason, her reflection wasn't present in the mirror, but as a kid, I didn't give that much thought. Perhaps if I paid attention to that detail, I would have been unnerved me more than it did. While I felt a little frightened by the sharp camera angles, the oversimplified character designs, and the eerie piano music droning in the background, I still was determined to watch the movie as its entirety. I didn't want to face another day of school being called a mama's boy and a chicken because I hadn't watching these things that were far out my age range. The piano music seemed like it was coming from one of those old, busted record players. In fact, it was. The camera panned up the window. It steadily began to fade into glass. It wasn't showing the contents of the room behind the window. It was actually showing inside of the glass once again. Inside the window, you could see an overweight character, drawn far differently from the female outlet. He almost resembled Santa Claus, having a long white mustache jutting from his upper lip and curling at the end. Rosy red cheeks that looked like they'd burn your hands if you touched them. Twinkling baby blue eyes that glistened as if they were made out of glass themselves. The detailed drawing was a rip-off of Santa. Stood next to a table that was considerably out of proportion to him. Sitting upon the table was an old record player. The base was fashioned from beautiful blocks of wood, detailed with small bits of gold. The man turned a small crank on the side of the box, creating the music that sent chills straight through my bones. At 6, I was not to use things like Mary Had a Little Lamb, not the type of music that played at funerals. Turn the crank! Turn the crank! He suddenly sputtered as the camera zoomed onto his hands. Turn the crank! The motions were agonizingly slow, forcing me to feel the stillness of the movement. Turn the crank! Turn the crank! I was beginning to feel less thrilled and more anxious. It took a moment to slide closer to the couch, where my dad was fast asleep, completely oblivious to the content that was on the television. While a slid along crackling sound was heard, it dragged on for what sounded like a lifetime. Sound growing louder and louder as it continued. I turned back to the screen when the sound caught my attention. The crank was the unnamed character was turning. It was being wound tighter and tighter, straining the gorgeous wooden base. The base began to reveal tiny cracks as the crank turned. The cracks grew larger, the sound grew louder, and the crank grew weaker. Turn the crank! Turn the crank! The cheery man shouted with a creepy, joyful voice. I could only assume that he had a smile on his face, but the only thing is the camera would show the record player slowly collapsing on itself. Turn the crank! Turn the crank! My eyes were beginning to fill with tears. I remember how loud those noises would always upset me when I was younger. I was an odd child. Neither silence nor noise pleased me. If it was too silent, I would be scared. If it was too noisy, I'd be equally scared. Unfortunately for me, this movie already manipulated both of those childhood fears. My teary eyes widened as the next scene of the movie took place. The beautiful record player finally gave out, the crank breaking apart into the jolly man's hand. The remaining bits of the record began to sputter a violent amount of smoke, which only hovered around the player, leaving every other inch of the room untouched. "No more. I must turn the crank," the man whispered, the camera focusing on his face and the face alone. His colored cheeks were about to growing pale, and his glimmering eyes were beginning to lose their lusters. Suddenly, those once sparkling blue eyes shattered, shards of glass falling to the floor. I was surprised that they didn't fling into the screen. They were just some sort of fell from the man's eye sockets. I later figured that the rain at the start of the film was actually been the glass falling from his face. The lonesome girl has finally sank. The screen cut to an abrupt moment of darkness, but only long enough to fade to the next scene, where another bird-eyes view of the street where the female character had been walking at the beginning of the film. There were shards of glass completely coating the street below. All you could see were the very tops of some of the buildings, which were all tinted with the very rusty shades of crimson because of the massive amount of broken glass. The camera began to lower the view, zooming in choppily cut frames, each one to the mast than the last. Each one closer to the mast than the last. At the last frame was presented, you could see an outlet-like character from the beginning, laying motionless in the midst of a glassy sea. The shards that surround her body were a pale shade of purple, because the cause from the color had completely drained her from her hair. At this point, I was bawling my eyes out. I may have been young, but I knew what a dead person looked like. I knew for sure that the girl was dead. No one could survive being pelted by such an enormous amount of glass like that. The scene changed at that point, showing a close-up of an hourglass. The camera was slowly, gently pulling away from the hourglass, which had grains of sand sliding through its midsection. It kind of reminded me of that soap opera, Days of Our Lives. It only had much more grim and against a colorless background. "She's completely fine now. You don't feel it. Don't you fret. Thanks for watching my show, kids. But you're not out of hell yet." At that point, I let out such a scream that my throat was still sore the next day. The scream was so sharp that I could even force my dad to bolt awake. He sat up to check on me, accidentally shifting his elbow on the television remote, causing the channel to change. What I saw was the channel change me more confused than I already was. The logo on the Adult Swim flashed up upon the screen. The next show started, as if it was the television that had been on Cartoon Network at all that night. My dad apologized for accidentally switching the channel, hitting the recall button on the remote. I was too busy sobbing with fear to stop him. When the channel finally returned to that station that aired the supposed movie, a message popped up on the screen. "Programming not authorized. Please confirm that you are subscribed to the channel or unplug the receiver to resolve the issue. If you could see this error, please contact your cable provider. We apologize for any inconvenience." The channel was apparently some late night movie network exclusive to the subscribed viewers, but that didn't explain how I was able to watch an entire film at an unauthorized channel. How it got on that channel, I have no clue. I guess it's possible that my dad had been bumped the remote into sleep, but I think I wouldn't have noticed about the channel changing. Instead, I only noticed an Adult Swim show leaving for the commercial, and then returning with that horrendous film. I slept in my mom's bed that night, trying to block the image of the film that stripped out my mind. Next morning, I could hear my mom loudly disgusting for not letting me watch late-night television with my dad. Looking back at that night nowadays, the film wasn't half as bad as most of the anime's crime shows, twisted cartoons, and morbid comments that I exposed myself to. I was just being silly and childish, but all children have horrifying experiences that wouldn't make them flinch as adults. Even though I have seen far worse, this film had left a bad impression in my mind. I mean, I still enjoy watching Adult Swim to this day, and now I can do without getting into some trouble. but I'm definitely on higher alert for anything overly suspicious, not only on with Adult Swim, but with late night movie showings as well. I have no interest in just seeing that film again, but I am curious about its title. I'd like to know the name so I can research any portion of the film I'd missed and possibly discover the voice actor that behind that demonic Santa-like man. Maybe you guys can help me with that.